Jasmine Crockett walked into the hearing room with the kind of calm determination that immediately drew everyone's attention, her presence alone signaling that this would not be a typical political exchange. And as she prepared to question Greg Abbott, the tension was palpable because the stakes were high, the topic controversial, and the memo in question had been circulating quietly behind closed doors, creating whispers of secrecy and speculation among lawmakers and the public alike. And Crockett began by laying out the context meticulously, outlining the key points of the memo and highlighting how it contradicted public statements that Abbott had made about state policies, particularly in areas where transparency and accountability were expected. And as she spoke, her tone remained steady, her voice clear, and the camera captured every nuance of her expression, demonstrating a combination of professionalism and moral clarity that commanded respect even from those predisposed to oppose her. And she methodically questioned Abbott about the timing of the memo's release, the motivations behind its directives, and the potential implications for the citizens of Texas, framing each inquiry in a way that connected the bureaucratic details to real-world consequences, illustrating how decisions made behind closed doors could affect families, schools, and communities. And her line of questioning was not merely confrontational, but rooted in an insistence on truth, an insistence on accountability, and the audience could sense that this was more than political theater. This was a demand for clarity, and as the questions intensified, Abbott struggled to maintain composure, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, deflecting with generalities and avoiding specifics, which only amplified Crockett's points because every hesitation, every sidestep was noted, both by the cameras and the public, and she skillfully highlighted discrepancies between Abbott's public assurances and the confidential guidance in the memo, demonstrating that what the public had been told did not fully align with what the administration had privately planned, and viewers watching from home could see the evidence laid out in a logical, compelling sequence, each document, each quote, each timeline presented in a way that built an undeniable narrative. And at a pivotal moment, Crockett paused to allow the weight of her question to sink in, letting silence emphasize what words alone could not, and in that silence, the tension was almost tangible, as if the room collectively held its breath. And then she delivered the follow-up, asking pointedly about accountability measures, internal oversight, and whether any officials involved in drafting the memo had disclosed potential conflicts of interest. And as Abbott fumbled through an evasive response, Crockett summarized the core issue, that secrecy in governance eroded trust, and transparency was not optional, it was essential for democracy to function. And her approach was relentless yet precise, never descending into theatrics, because her credibility, her reputation for integrity, and her dedication to facts were her most potent tools. And as she wrapped up the initial line of questioning, she directly addressed the audience, subtly reminding them of the stakes, explaining how citizen engagement was vital, and encouraging them to stay informed, to hold leaders accountable. And in that moment, she included a subtle but important call to action, saying that if viewers wanted to follow these crucial developments and understand the truth behind political maneuvers, they should subscribe, turn on notifications, and remain vigilant, because democracy depended on an informed public. And as the hearing continued, the energy in the room shifted, the dynamics of power subtly tilting in response to her precise, incisive questioning. And part of the power of this moment lay in the narrative she constructed, the story she told, not just about the memo itself, but about the broader issues of governance, responsibility, and ethical leadership. And by connecting the abstract details of bureaucratic policy to tangible consequences in people's lives, Crockett ensured that the audience, both in the room and watching remotely, understood why this moment mattered, why it wasn't simply another headline, and why political accountability was not optional but necessary. And as the cameras captured Abbott's increasingly strained demeanor, it became clear that Jasmine Crockett's strategy was working, that her preparation, her research, and her ability to communicate complex information in an accessible yet rigorous manner was compelling, and every follow-up question she asked peeled back another layer of obfuscation, further exposing the reality of the secret memo, demonstrating that meticulous preparation, ethical conviction, and fearless inquiry could create moments of truth in a political landscape often clouded by spin and deflection, and as Part 1 concludes, the viewers are left with an appreciation not only for the specific revelations of the memo, but also for the power of principled, courageous leadership in exposing hidden truths, setting the stage for the deeper examination that follows in the next parts of this discussion. As the hearing moved forward, Jasmine Crockett intensified her line of questioning, shifting from the general context of Greg Abbott's secret memo to the specific implications for state agencies, programs, and the citizens they were meant to serve, and the audience could immediately sense that Crockett's strategy was not only to reveal the content of the memo, but to unravel the logic behind it, connecting every directive, every guideline, and every internal note to the tangible consequences that would ripple through communities across Texas, and she began by examining how the memo affected public safety initiatives, scrutinizing the allocation of funds, the prioritization of enforcement actions, and the transparency of communication between state officials and local governments, and as she methodically dissected each section of the memo, Abbott appeared increasingly uncomfortable, fidgeting and offering vague reassurances that did little to address the pointed inquiries, and Crockett's ability to juxtapose the confidential content of the memo with public statements that contradicted it created an undeniable tension in the room, a tension that amplified with each follow-up question, because Crockett was relentless yet precise, highlighting not just the discrepancies but the ethical considerations, the policy misalignments, and the potential legal ramifications that Abbott's administration could face if these issues were left unexamined. And the cameras captured the subtle shifts in body language, the fleeting glances exchanged between staffers, and the momentary hesitation before Abbott attempted to answer, all of which underscored the effectiveness of Crockett's approach, and her questions were not merely rhetorical, they were carefully constructed to illuminate patterns of secrecy, selective disclosure, and administrative opacity, patterns that, when revealed to the public, challenged assumptions about leadership, accountability, and governance, and viewers watching online could follow the logic as Crockett broke down the memo section by section, using clear explanations, analogies, and timelines to make a complex bureaucratic document accessible and impactful, and the hearing's proceedings took on a rhythm, with Crockett controlling the pace, guiding the audience through a narrative that balanced factual reporting with interpretive insight, demonstrating how each decision, each instruction, and each omission in the memo reflected larger priorities, value judgments, and political calculations, and as she moved to questions about resource allocation, she connected abstract numbers and funding allocations to the experiences of ordinary Texans, showing how these internal decisions affected hospitals, schools, law enforcement agencies, and social services, and this translation of policy into lived reality made the issues immediate, tangible, and urgent for anyone watching, and as Abbott attempted to pivot, Crockett anticipated his evasions, countering them with evidence, citations, and historical context that rendered superficial deflections ineffective, and the tension escalated as she probed the memo's treatment of vulnerable populations, scrutinizing directives that impacted immigration enforcement, healthcare access, and emergency preparedness, and she framed her questions in terms of fairness, transparency, and the public trust, highlighting that decisions made behind closed doors carried moral as well as practical consequences, and the audience could see that Crockett's approach was both strategic and principled, a combination that created undeniable pressure on Abbott while maintaining a tone of professionalism and authority, and throughout the session, she wove a narrative that emphasized the importance of oversight, reminding both lawmakers and the public that secrecy was not an acceptable substitute for accountability. And as the hearing progressed, the momentum shifted, with Abbott increasingly on the defensive, struggling to justify policy decisions that Crockett had laid bare with evidence-based questioning, and her meticulous preparation, her command of the facts, and her ability to anticipate counterarguments allowed her to maintain control of the discussion, guiding it toward clarity and truth rather than political spin, and each revelation prompted reactions in the room, some subtle, some more visible, reflecting the broader impact of her questions on colleagues, staff, and the press, and as she addressed the broader implications of the memo, she emphasized systemic issues, patterns of opaque decision making and the need for public oversight to prevent similar situations in the future, and her narrative made it clear that this was not merely about a single document, but about reinforcing democratic principles, ethical leadership, and responsible governance. And by consistently connecting abstract policy to human impact, Crockett ensured that the audience remained engaged, informed, and emotionally invested, understanding that the stakes were not hypothetical but very real. And as she concluded her second major segment of questioning, the viewers were left with a clear understanding of the memo's content, the administration's internal rationale, and the tangible consequences for the people of Texas, while also appreciating Crockett's skillful navigation of political power, evidence-based inquiry, and ethical leadership. And the story of the memo, its secrets, and its exposure continued to unfold in subsequent lines of questioning, setting the stage for further revelations about accountability, transparency, and the responsibilities of those in power, as Crockett prepared to delve even deeper into the administration's decision-making processes, and the audience could sense that this was more than a single moment in a hearing. It was a lesson in civic vigilance, the power of principled inquiry, and the importance of holding elected officials to the highest standards of integrity and transparency. As the hearing progressed into its third phase, Jasmine Crockett shifted her focus from procedural and policy discrepancies to the broader implications of Greg Abbott's secret memo, carefully connecting the internal communications to long-term consequences for the governance of Texas and the well-being of its citizens, and she began by illustrating how the directives outlined in the memo affected not just isolated departments, but entire networks of state agencies, demonstrating that decisions made in private could ripple outward in ways that were both complex and deeply consequential. And she methodically laid out scenarios in which the lack of transparency could lead to misallocation of resources, miscommunication between agencies, and ultimately, policies that failed to serve the public effectively. And with each example, she drew clear connections between bureaucratic language and real-world impact, ensuring that the audience, both in the room and watching remotely, could understand why the memo mattered, why accountability was non-negotiable, and why secrecy, no matter how bureaucratically justified, undermined public trust. And Crockett's questioning was relentless, precise, and logical, guiding Abbott through a sequence of queries that left little room for obfuscation. And as she pressed further, she focused on specific sections of the memo where instructions were either ambiguous, contradictory, or outright misaligned with public statements. And she asked pointedly about the motivations behind these discrepancies, whether they were the result of oversight, political calculation, or intentional misdirection. And every moment Abbott hesitated or deflected, Crockett followed up with evidence, documents, and past statements, building a compelling narrative that revealed inconsistencies and exposed vulnerabilities in the administration's handling of critical issues. And the audience could see that her approach was not confrontational for the sake of drama, but strategic, grounded in research, facts, and a clear understanding of governance. And she framed her questions in ways that highlighted the importance of transparency, integrity, and accountability, reminding viewers that leadership was measured not only by decisions made but by the honesty and clarity with which those decisions were communicated. And as she delved into issues affecting vulnerable communities, such as healthcare access, disaster preparedness, and social services, she connected each point to specific directives in the memo, demonstrating how theoretical policy translated into tangible effects on people's lives, and her ability to translate bureaucratic language into relatable, understandable outcomes made the hearing compelling, accessible, and urgent. And as Abbott attempted to deflect responsibility, Crockett countered with methodical precision, drawing on timelines, internal communications, and documented inconsistencies, highlighting that public accountability was not optional, and that officials had a responsibility to explain, justify, and correct missteps. And as she continued, she emphasized that the memo was not an isolated document, but part of a larger pattern of secretive decision-making that demanded scrutiny. And she challenged Abbott to clarify not only what had been written but why, how, and by whose authority. And this relentless pursuit of clarity placed Abbott on the defensive, making his previously rehearsed responses seem insufficient and exposing gaps between public statements and private directives. and the cameras captured every reaction, every pause, every slight shift in tone, emphasizing the drama of truth unfolding in real time, and Crockett's demeanor remained composed, professional, and authoritative throughout, demonstrating the power of preparation, ethical conviction, and calm persistence in a high-pressure political environment, and she seamlessly transitioned between policy analysis, ethical considerations, and public accountability, creating a narrative that was not only informative, but also emotionally resonant, making the implications of the memo clear for ordinary citizens and experts alike. And as the third phase of questioning continued, she turned to the issue of oversight mechanisms, asking whether checks and balances had been effectively employed, whether any officials had flagged potential conflicts, and how internal review processes had failed or succeeded. And as Abbott struggled to provide coherent answers, Crockett used the opportunity to educate the audience about the importance of internal governance, transparency, and citizen engagement, demonstrating that accountability is a multi-layered concept that requires both procedural rigor and ethical responsibility, and the energy in the room reflected the impact of her questioning, with observers noting that her preparation, clarity, and unwavering pursuit of the facts were reshaping the dynamics of the hearing. And by the end of this part of the session, Crockett had not only exposed significant gaps in Abbott's explanations, but had also elevated the conversation beyond partisan politics, framing it as a matter of democratic principle, the rule of law, and the public interest, and viewers could see that this moment exemplified how informed, courageous leadership could illuminate hidden truths, demand accountability, and inspire civic awareness. And while the immediate focus was on the memo itself, the broader takeaway was clear: the public had the right, and indeed the responsibility, to scrutinize the actions of their leaders, to demand transparency, and to insist that government operate with integrity. And as Part 3 concludes, the stage was set for the final phase of the hearing, where Jasmine Crockett would connect all the pieces together, reveal the broader implications of the memo, and challenge Abbott to answer fundamental questions about trust, governance, and the responsibilities of those in positions of power, leaving viewers eagerly anticipating the resolution of this dramatic and illuminating political confrontation. As the hearing reached its final stage, Jasmine Crockett brought together all the threads of her investigation into Greg Abbott's secret memo, demonstrating not only the content of the document, but the broader implications for governance, public trust, and accountability. And she began by revisiting the key revelations she had already exposed in previous rounds of questioning, systematically summarizing how internal directives diverged from public statements, how ambiguities in the memo had created potential risks for state agencies, and how the secrecy surrounding the document undermined transparency. And she framed each revelation in terms of tangible consequences for ordinary Texans, linking policy decisions to real-world effects on education, healthcare, disaster response, and social services. And as she spoke, the audience could see the depth of her preparation, her ability to synthesize complex information, and her talent for conveying nuance without sacrificing clarity. And Abbott's responses became increasingly constrained, his attempts at deflection less effective, as Crockett's meticulous presentation left little room for misdirection, and she strategically highlighted inconsistencies, drawing attention to both what the memo said and what it omitted, emphasizing that omissions could be as consequential as direct directives. And by connecting abstract bureaucratic language to ethical considerations, legal responsibilities, and the public's right to know, Crockett elevated the discussion beyond politics into a matter of civic principle. And she pressed Abbott to explain not only the reasoning behind the memo, but also what steps had been taken to ensure oversight, prevent misuse, and maintain accountability, challenging him to address the human consequences of administrative secrecy. And the tension in the room was palpable, as Crockett's questions cut through rehearsed talking points, exposing gaps, contradictions, and lapses in judgment, and viewers watching at home could follow the narrative unfold with clarity, seeing the systematic unraveling of a document that had previously operated in shadows. And as she continued, Crockett emphasized the broader lessons to be learned from the memo, framing the situation as a call for stronger transparency measures, rigorous oversight mechanisms, and a recommitment to public service that prioritizes ethical governance over political expediency, and she tied each point back to accountability, reminding both lawmakers and the public that secrecy erodes trust, that clarity and openness are fundamental to democratic leadership, and that citizens have both the right and the responsibility to demand transparency. And throughout the hearing, Crockett maintained a tone of calm authority, balancing direct confrontation with measured explanation, ensuring that the discussion remained fact-based, professional, and persuasive. And as Abbott attempted to pivot or downplay concerns, she anticipated every evasion, countering it with evidence, precedent, and moral reasoning, and the narrative she constructed guided the audience through the labyrinth of internal communications, policy implications, and political consequences, leaving no question unexamined and no detail unconnected. And by the conclusion of her questioning, Crockett had fully exposed the implications of the secret memo, revealing both the administrative logic behind it and the risks it posed to public trust and effective governance. And she summarized her findings in a way that underscored the importance of accountability, transparency, and citizen engagement, highlighting that the memo was not simply a bureaucratic artifact, but a reflection of the choices, priorities, and responsibilities of those in power. And as the hearing adjourned, the impact of her work was clear. Media coverage immediately highlighted the discrepancies she had exposed, public commentary emphasized the questions she had raised, and Abbott's credibility faced renewed scrutiny, demonstrating that careful preparation, ethical conviction, and relentless pursuit of truth could create tangible political consequences. And Crockett's approach also served as a model for effective leadership, showing that combining knowledge, clarity, and principled inquiry can illuminate hidden truths and hold powerful figures accountable. And as Part 4 concludes, viewers were left not only with a complete understanding of the memo and its implications, but also with a broader appreciation for the power of informed, courageous leadership. And the narrative ended with a subtle reminder that civic engagement, scrutiny, and vigilance are essential in a functioning democracy, and that individuals who step forward with preparation, integrity, and clarity, like Jasmine Crockett, can change the conversation, reveal hidden truths, and inspire accountability, ensuring that the public is informed, that leaders are responsible, and that democracy, though imperfect, continues to be strengthened through transparency, engagement, and principled action.